Hey fellas, tonight we return to a world of cold winds and colder betrayals, a place with no walls, no maps, just the endless Mongolian steppe and a boy with a name no one would remember. Yet, this is not the story of the great Genghis Khan, conqueror of worlds. It's the quieter story before all that, before power, before horses turned into armies, just survival, struggle, and the silence of exile. So take a breath, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum. And if these slow walks through forgotten histories help you rest, feel free to like and subscribe. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now let's go back to the 1170s, to a boy named Temujin. The wolves are circling, and his father just died. Picture yourself as a child on the vast Mongolian steppe, where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, like an ocean of grass under an enormous sky. The year is somewhere around 1172, though dates mean little in this world where seasons matter more than calendars, where the movement of herds and the changing color of grass mark time more reliably than any human counting. You are 9 years old, maybe 10, and your name is Temujin, a name that carries the weight of your father's hopes but holds no power yet in the harsh reality of nomadic life. The steppe is your entire universe, a landscape so immense that it dwarfs human ambition and reduces even the mightiest warriors to tiny figures moving slowly across its surface. In summer, it becomes a sea of green that waves in the constant wind, broken only by the occasional cluster of felt tents and the dark shapes of grazing animals. In winter, it transforms into something far more brutal, a frozen wasteland where the wind cuts through layers of wool and fur as if they were nothing, where survival becomes a daily negotiation with forces that care nothing for human plans or desires. Your home is not a place, but a collection of possessions that can be packed and moved whenever circumstances demand. The round felt tent that shelters your family can be assembled or taken down in less than an hour, its wooden frame and wool coverings designed by generations of nomads who understood that permanence is a luxury the steppe does not allow. Inside this portable sanctuary, the air is thick with the smoke of dried dung burning in the central fire pit, providing the only warmth and light available in a world where wood is scarce and precious. The smell of this smoke has become as familiar to you as your own breathing, mixing with the sense of fermented mare's milk, cured meat, and the wool clothing that everyone wears in layers against the unpredictable weather. These smells define the boundaries of safety and belonging, marking the difference between the known world of family and the vast unknown that begins just beyond the tent's entrance. When you step outside, the wind immediately reminds you of your smallness, carrying with it the voices of other camps, the calls of animals, and sometimes the distant thunder of hoofbeats that might signal either opportunity or danger. Your father, Uge, is a man whose presence fills the tent and commands respect from other warriors, but even his strength seems diminished by the enormity of the landscape that surrounds your small family group. He is a chieftain of sorts, leading a modest collection of followers who owe him loyalty based on kinship, mutual benefit, and the complex web of obligations that holds nomadic society together. But his authority extends only as far as his ability to protect and provide for those who follow him, and on the steppe, that authority can disappear as quickly as morning frost under the summer sun. The recent weeks have brought changes that you sense more than understand, subtle shifts in the behavior of adults that suggest trouble approaching like storm clouds on the distant horizon. Conversations stop when you enter the tent, and the men who visit your father speak in lower voices than usual, their words carrying undertones of concern and planning. Your mother, Hulun, moves through her daily tasks with attention that was not there before, her eyes frequently turning toward the tent's entrance as if watching for something she hopes will not arrive. The tribal politics that govern life on the steppe are as complex and changeable as the weather itself, involving alliances that shift with the seasons and rivalries that can smolder for generations before erupting into open conflict. Your father's position in this intricate network of relationships has been built carefully over years, but you are beginning to understand that it rests on foundations that could crumble without warning. The loyalty of followers, the respect of rivals, the delicate balance of power that allows any leader to survive, all of these things require constant attention and can be lost through a single miscalculation or moment of weakness. The horses that graze around your camp represent both wealth and vulnerability, their numbers indicating your family's prosperity, but also marking you as a target for those who have fewer animals and more desperation. Each horse requires daily care and protection, and their welfare is tied directly to your family's ability to survive in an environment where mobility can mean the difference between life and death. These animals are not pets or simple transportation, but partners in the ongoing struggle to extract a living from a landscape that offers both abundance and hardship in unpredictable measures. Your daily life revolves around tasks that seem routine but carry tremendous importance for your family's continued survival. Learning to ride is not a recreational activity, but an essential skill that could determine whether you live or die when circumstances force rapid movement across dangerous terrain. Understanding the behavior of animals, reading the signs of weather changes, knowing which plants can provide nutrition and which ones might kill, all of these abilities are being absorbed gradually through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. The isolation of nomadic life means that your education comes primarily from family members and the occasional interactions with other groups encountered during seasonal movements or gatherings around water sources. There are no schools, no books, no teachers other than the adults whose knowledge has been shaped by their own experiences of survival and adaptation to the steppe's demands. What you learn is practical and immediate, focused on skills and information that have direct application to the challenges of nomadic existence. The concept of childhood as a protected period of play and gradual development does not exist in your world, where the harsh realities of steppe life require every family member to contribute to the collective effort of survival from an early age. You are expected to take on responsibilities that would be considered inappropriate for someone your age in more settled societies, but these expectations reflect the practical necessities of life rather than any lack of care or affection from your family. The recent death of your father has shattered the careful structure that protected your family's position within the larger tribal community, leaving you and your relatives exposed to dangers that were previously held in check by his presence and authority. The men who followed him now face difficult decisions about where to transfer their loyalty, and many are already beginning to distance themselves from your family in preparation for aligning with leaders who can offer better prospects for security and advancement. Your mother's position has become particularly precarious, as a widow with young children represents both a burden and an opportunity for other tribal groups. She could be absorbed into another family through marriage, but this would likely mean separation from her children and the loss of what little independence she currently maintains. The alternative is to attempt survival as the head of a greatly reduced family group, a prospect that carries enormous risks but also preserves the possibility that you and your siblings might someday reclaim your father's position or achieve something even greater. The wolves that circle your camp in the growing darkness are not merely animals seeking carrion, but symbols of all the forces that threaten your family's precarious existence. They represent the human predators who see your weakened state as an opportunity for advancement, the natural dangers that become more threatening without adequate protection, and the simple reality that survival on the steppe requires constant vigilance against threats that can emerge from any direction at any time. As you lie in your tent listening to the wind and the distant calls of night animals, you have no way of knowing that this moment of vulnerability and fear will eventually forge the character and determination that will reshape the entire world. The boy who falls asleep tonight, uncertain whether his family will survive the coming winter, carries within him the potential to become one of history's most consequential figures. But that transformation lies hidden in a future that seems impossibly distant from the immediate concerns of hunger, cold, and the ever-present possibility of violent death. Chapter 1: The Boy Named Temujin. In the vast expanse of the Mongolian steppe, where the earth meets the sky in an unbroken line that stretches beyond the limits of human vision, your story begins not with fanfare or ceremony, but with a birth that carries whispers of destiny in its very first moments. The year is around 1162, though the exact date remains lost to the flowing seasons of nomadic time, where lunar cycles and the migration patterns of animals matter more than the precise counting of days that occupies settled peoples. Your mother, Holun, labors through the long hours of a spring night, while the wind carries the scent of new grass across the rolling hills that surround your family's camp. The yurt where you enter the world is filled with the familiar warmth of a dung fire burning in its center, the smoke rising through the opening at the top of the dome-shaped dwelling that has sheltered countless generations of your ancestors. The felt walls, thick and sturdy against the constant wind, create a cocoon of safety in the midst of an environment that offers little protection from the elements or from the human dangers that roam the steppes like wolves seeking opportunity. Inside this portable sanctuary, the women of your clan gather to assist with your birth, their voices joining in the low, rhythmic chants that have accompanied such moments since time immemorial. When you finally emerge into the flickering light of the fire, your tiny fist is clenched around something that causes the midwives to gasp and whisper among themselves with a mixture of awe and apprehension. In your palm rests a clot of blood, dark and solid, gripped so tightly that it seems you fought to bring this token with you from whatever realm exists before birth. The old women who have witnessed countless births recognize immediately that this is no ordinary beginning, for according to the ancient beliefs of your people, a child born clutching blood in their hand is destined for great power, marked by the eternal blue sky itself, for a life that will shake the foundations of the world. Your father, Yesge, receives the news of your birth, and the accompanying omen with the stoic acceptance of a man who has learned to read the signs that the steppe provides to those wise enough to pay attention. He names you Temujin, after a Tatar chief he had recently captured, a choice that reflects both his recent victory and perhaps his unconscious recognition that you will someday need a name strong enough to bear the weight of conquest. The name flows like wind across grass when spoken aloud, carrying within its syllables the promise of movement, of change, of a force that will not be contained by the traditional boundaries that separate tribe from tribe across the endless grasslands. The sacred river On flows near your birthplace, its waters running clear and cold from the distant mountains toward the vast lake systems that punctuate the steppe like jewels scattered across a green carpet. This river will become one of your earliest and most enduring memories, its constant murmur providing a soundtrack to your childhood that speaks of permanence in a world where everything else seems to shift and change with the seasons. The unknown carries within its flowing waters the spirits of ancestors and the promises of future generations, connecting your small family group to the eternal cycles that govern all life on the steppe. Along the river bank, your clan's yurts are arranged in the careful patterns that speak of relationships and hierarchies invisible to outsiders, but immediately comprehensible to anyone raised in the nomadic tradition. Each circular dwelling represents a family unit, but the spacing between them, the orientation of their doors, and the positioning relative to your father's larger yurt all communicate information about status, kinship, and the delicate web of obligations that holds your community together. These felt homes can be dismantled and moved within hours when circumstances require, but for now they rest in temporary permanence beside the life-giving waters that make settlement possible. Your father's yurt stands slightly apart from the others, its size and the quality of its decorations marking his position as a minor chief among the Kiad clan of the Mongols. The door faces south according to ancient custom, welcoming the warming influence of the sun, while offering protection from the harsh northern winds that bring winter's bite to the steppe. Inside, the space is organized with the precision that comes from generations of nomadic living, every item having its designated place in the cramped but efficient interior that must serve all the functions of home, meeting hall, and storage facility. The clan that surrounds your birth represents a fragment of the larger Mongol people, itself just one group among the many tribes that populate the steppes in an ever-shifting mosaic of alliance and conflict. Your kinsmen are herders and warriors, following the ancient patterns of life that their ancestors established centuries ago when they first learned to live in harmony with the rhythms of grass and weather. They move their animals according to seasonal needs, gathering in larger groups for protection during dangerous times, scattering into smaller family units when resources become scarce or when political pressures make concentration too risky. The world into which you are born appears quiet and pastoral to casual observation, with its endless vistas of waving grass and scattered herds of horses, sheep, and cattle, dotting the landscape like living punctuation marks across the green manuscript of the steppe. But beneath this serene surface lies a reality of constant tension and potential violence, where survival depends not just on understanding the natural world, but on navigating the complex and often deadly relationships between competing groups of people who share the same territory and compete for the same resources. Your earliest memories begin to form in this environment of deceptive tranquility, where the most profound experiences often involve the simplest elements of nomadic existence. The horses that graze near your family's camp become your first teachers, their behavior serving as a constant lesson in the dynamics of power, hierarchy, and survival that will shape your understanding of leadership throughout your life. You watch as the stallions establish dominance through displays of strength and aggression, as mares protect their foals with fierce determination, as the herd moves as a single organism when threatened, responding to dangers that individual animals might not even perceive. These horses represent far more than transportation or wealth in your world, though they serve both those functions with crucial importance. They are partners in the nomadic way of life, enabling the mobility that allows your people to follow the grass and water that sustain their animals and themselves. A Mongol warrior without his horse is like a bird without wings, capable of survival, but unable to truly thrive in an environment that demands rapid movement across vast distances. The relationship between rider and mount becomes so intimate that the boundary between human and animal consciousness seems to blur during long rides across the steppes. Your memories of these early encounters with horses carry the quality of dreams, filled with sensations rather than clear visual details. You remember the warmth of a mare's flank as you lean against her while she grazes peacefully in the morning sun. You recall the rhythmic sound of hooves against earth as the herd moves from one grazing area to another, a sound that becomes as familiar and comforting as your mother's heartbeat. You retain impressions of being lifted onto a horse's back while still barely able to walk, your small hands gripping the coarse mane while the animal moves with careful gentleness, understanding instinctively that it carries precious cargo. The wind that constantly sweeps across the steppe becomes another fundamental element of your earliest awareness, its voice changing with the seasons and weather patterns in ways that you learn to read long before you understand the meaning of the words that describe such phenomena. In spring, the wind carries the fresh scent of new growth and the promise of abundance ahead, its touch gentle and warming as it moves across the newly green landscape. Summer brings winds that smell of flowers and the rich earth warmed by long days of sunshine, while autumn winds carry the sharper scents of drying grass and the first hints of the cold months approaching. Winter winds on the steppe possess a quality that seems almost alive in their intensity and persistence, cutting through layers of felt and fur with a determination that makes survival a constant battle against the elements. These winds teach you early lessons about the power of natural forces and the importance of preparation and respect for the environment that both sustains and threatens your existence. You learn to read the subtle changes in wind direction and intensity that herald approaching weather changes, knowledge that will prove essential throughout your life as a nomadic leader. The silence that exists in the spaces between wind gusts becomes another crucial element of your early education, teaching you to listen for the sounds that carry information essential to survival and success. In the deep quiet of a still morning, you can hear the approach of riders from distances that would make detection impossible in more densely settled areas. The calls of birds take on meaning as they signal the presence of predators or the discovery of water sources. Even the absence of expected sounds becomes significant, warning of dangers that might not be immediately visible, but require immediate attention and response. These periods of profound silence also provide opportunities for the kind of deep listening that connects you to the spiritual dimensions of steppe life, where the boundary between the physical and metaphysical worlds remains permeable and constantly shifting. In the quiet moments when wind subsides and animals rest peacefully, You begin to sense the presence of the ancestral spirits that your people believe inhabit every significant feature of the landscape. The river spirits that dwell in the On, the sky spirits that govern weather and fortune, the earth spirits that determine the success of grazing and the health of animals. All of these invisible presences make themselves known to those who possess the patience and sensitivity to perceive their subtle influences. Your father, Isuge, moves through this landscape of physical and spiritual realities with the confidence of a man who has learned to read both the visible and invisible signs that determine success or failure in nomadic life. He teaches you through example rather than formal instruction, allowing you to observe his interactions with horses, his decisions about when and where to move the clan's herds, his careful management of relationships with other tribal leaders. These lessons unfold gradually over months and years, accumulating in your young mind like layers of sediment that will eventually form the bedrock of your own leadership abilities. The seasonal rhythms that govern all life on the steppe become the calendar by which you measure time and growth, each cycle bringing new challenges and opportunities that test your developing skills and understanding. Spring brings the excitement of new births among the herds, the joy of renewed abundance after winter's scarcity, and the complex decisions about where to establish summer grazing areas. You participate in these activities at a level appropriate to your age and abilities, gradually taking on more responsibility as your competence and reliability increase. Summer represents the height of abundance and activity, when the grass grows thick and nutritious, when mare's milk flows freely for the fermented beverages that sustain adult social life, when the long days provide ample time for the activities that maintain and strengthen community bonds. During these months of plenty, you learn the skills that will define your adult capabilities: riding, herding, the basics of combat, and the intricate social protocols that govern interactions between families and clans. Autumn brings the sobering awareness that abundance is temporary and that survival depends on careful preparation for the lean months ahead. You observe as your family makes the critical decisions about which animals to slaughter for winter provisions, which routes to follow in search of protected grazing areas, how to balance the competing demands of safety and access to resources. These lessons in practical planning and risk assessment will later inform your understanding of military strategy and the management of vast territories and populations. Winter on the steppe tests every aspect of nomadic survival skills, demanding resourcefulness, endurance, and the kind of community cooperation that can mean the difference between life and death when resources become scarce and weather conditions turn hostile. During the long, dark months when the herds cluster together for warmth and protection, when travel becomes dangerous or impossible, you learn the patience and mental discipline that will later enable you to plan and execute campaigns that span years and cover distances that dwarf the seasonal migrations of your childhood. The stories told during winter evenings around the fire provide another crucial element of your early education, filling your imagination with tales of heroes and ancestors whose deeds established the patterns of honor and achievement that define Mongol cultural values. These narratives teach you about the possibilities that exist for those brave and skilled enough to seize them, while also providing cautionary examples of the consequences that await those who fail to respect the laws of nature and society that govern successful leadership. Your mother, Hulun, contributes her own wisdom to your developing understanding of the world, teaching you through her daily activities the complex skills required to maintain a nomadic household. From her, you learn about the preparation and preservation of food, the care and maintenance of clothing and equipment, the diplomatic skills required to manage relationships with other families and clans. Her strength and intelligence will later prove crucial to your family's survival during the difficult years that follow your father's death, demonstrating the kind of resilience and adaptability that characterizes successful steppe leadership. The religious and spiritual traditions of your people provide another layer of meaning to your childhood experiences, connecting everyday activities to cosmic purposes and eternal truths that transcend the immediate concerns of survival and success. You learn to recognize the sacred qualities of certain places and times, to perform the rituals that maintain harmony between human activities and natural forces, to seek guidance from the spiritual powers that influence all earthly affairs. This spiritual dimension of nomadic life will later inform your approach to conquest and empire building, providing a framework of meaning that transforms military success into divine mandate. The blood clot that marked your birth continues to resonate through your early years as family members and visitors remark on its significance, creating an atmosphere of expectation and special attention that shapes your developing sense of identity and purpose. You grow up knowing that you are marked for something extraordinary, though the specific nature of that destiny remains hidden in a future that stretches beyond the horizons of your childhood understanding. This awareness of special purpose provides both inspiration and burden, encouraging ambition while creating pressure to prove worthy of the destiny that the omen promised. As you grow from infant to toddler to young child, the patterns of your daily life establish the rhythms that will define your adult character and capabilities. You wake to the sounds of animals stirring and adults beginning their morning tasks. You spend your days in activities that gradually build the skills essential to nomadic success. You fall asleep to the murmur of adult conversations about the challenges and opportunities that each new day might bring. This routine, seemingly simple and repetitive, actually provides intensive training in all the abilities that will later enable you to lead armies across continents and establish an empire that spans from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. The quiet beginning of your life on the banks of the sacred On River carries within it all the elements that will eventually explode into world-changing significance. The horses that graze peacefully near your family's yurt will multiply into cavalry forces that no enemy can withstand. The wind that whispers across the grass will carry news of your conquests to terrified populations thousands of miles away. The silence that teaches you to listen carefully will become the foundation for intelligence networks that span continents. But for now, in these early years of memory formation and skill development, you remain simply Temujin, a nomad child learning the ancient ways of the steppe, unaware that the entire future of the world rests in your small hands that once clutched a clot of blood as you entered a reality that would never be quite large enough to contain your ambitions. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Cup. The vast steppes of Mongolia stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, their gentle light casting long shadows across the grasslands where young Temujin slept peacefully beside his family's ger. The felt walls of their dwelling provided warmth against the cool night air, and the soft sounds of horses shifting nearby created a rhythm as old as the nomadic way of life itself. In these quiet moments before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath, no one could have imagined how quickly everything would change for this small family living among the scattered tribes of the Mongol Confederation. Yes, Uge, Temujin's father, was a man of considerable presence among his people. His voice carried weight in tribal councils, and his reputation as a skilled warrior had been earned through countless seasons of both conflict and diplomacy across the steppes. When he spoke, other men listened, leaning forward slightly to catch his words, as they were carried away by the ever-present wind that swept across the grasslands. His hands, weathered by years of gripping reins and weapons, were gentle when they rested on his son's shoulders, and his eyes held the kind of steady wisdom that comes from understanding both the harsh realities and simple pleasures of nomadic life. The morning that would change everything began like countless others before it. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold that gradually gave way to the clear blue of another day on the steppes. Yesuke prepared to depart on what seemed like a routine journey, one of the many diplomatic missions that were part of his responsibilities as a tribal leader. These journeys were essential threads in the complex web of relationships that held the nomadic world together, requiring careful negotiation and the maintenance of delicate alliances that could shift as quickly as the wind direction on the plains. The Tatars were an old enemy, their names spoken with caution around campfires, and their territory marked by invisible boundaries that every Mongol child learned to recognize. For generations, blood had been spilled between the Mongols and Tatars, creating wounds that seemed to heal only slowly, if at all. Yet the nature of steppe politics demanded that even enemies sometimes found themselves sitting across from each other, sharing meals and discussing terms of temporary peace or mutual benefit. It was a dangerous dance, this interaction with rivals, but one that experienced leaders like Yesuke had performed many times before. When Yesuke encountered the Tatar group during his journey, the meeting initially followed the established patterns of such encounters. Words were exchanged with careful politeness, and eventually an invitation was extended to share a meal. In the culture of the steppes, hospitality was sacred, and refusing such an offer could be seen as a grave insult. The gurs were arranged in their traditional circle, smoke rising peacefully from cooking fires, and the scene appeared as normal as any gathering of nomads who had paused in their travels to rest and replenish themselves. The meal proceeded with the usual rhythm of such occasions. Fermented mare's milk was passed from hand to hand, its slightly sour taste familiar and comforting to men who had grown up drinking it. Mutton was prepared and shared, the meat tender from slow cooking over carefully tended flames. Conversations flowed around topics common to steppe dwellers: the quality of pasturage, the movement of herds, news from distant tribes, and the ever-important matter of weather patterns that could mean the difference between prosperity and hardship for nomadic peoples. But beneath this veneer of normal hospitality, darker intentions were taking shape. The Tatars had not forgotten their grievances against Yesuke and his clan, and they had decided that this meeting would provide an opportunity for revenge that might not come again. In the preparation of the food and drink, they had made careful additions that were invisible to the eye and nearly tasteless on the tongue. The poison they used was subtle, designed not to act immediately, but to work its deadly effect gradually, allowing the perpetrators to be far away when their victim finally succumbed. Yesuke consumed the tainted food and drink without suspicion, engaging in the diplomatic conversations that were the purpose of his visit. The discussions continued for some time, touching on various matters of mutual interest and concern. Eventually, the meeting concluded, and Yesuke took his leave, beginning the journey back to his family with no immediate indication that anything was amiss. The poison was working its way through his system, but its effects were still subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary travel fatigue, or perhaps the beginning of a minor illness. The ride back across the steppes was long and peaceful, with Yesuke's horse maintaining its steady pace through familiar territory. The landscape rolled by in its eternal rhythm of gentle hills and wide valleys, dotted with the occasional stream that caught the sunlight and reflected it back toward the vast sky above. As the hours passed, however, Yesuke began to feel an unusual weariness settling into his bones, deeper than the normal tiredness that came from long days in the saddle. At first, he attributed this growing weakness to the accumulated effects of recent travels and responsibilities. Leadership required constant vigilance and effort, and even strong men sometimes felt the weight of their duties pressing down upon them. But as his horse carried him steadily homeward, the symptoms grew more pronounced. His vision began to blur slightly at the edges, and a persistent ache settled into his stomach, growing stronger with each mile that passed beneath his mount's hooves. By the time Yesuke reached his family's encampment, there was no longer any doubt that something was seriously wrong. His usual erect posture had given way to a slump in the saddle, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that alarmed those who knew him well. Young Temujin, playing with his siblings near the family jair, looked up to see his father's horse approaching at an uncharacteristically slow pace, and something in the sight filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. The next few days passed in a blur of increasing desperation and growing fear. Yesuke's condition deteriorated rapidly once the poison had fully taken hold, and despite the efforts of the tribe's healers and shamans, nothing could be done to counteract its effects. The traditional remedies that had served the nomads for generations proved powerless against this particular form of treachery. Herbs were boiled into bitter teas, incantations were spoken over smoking fires, and sacred rituals were performed, but the poison continued its relentless work. Young Temujin watched helplessly as his father's strength ebbed away like water disappearing into thirsty earth. The man who had seemed so powerful and permanent, whose presence had provided security and direction for their entire family, was becoming weaker with each passing hour. The boy's understanding of what was happening was incomplete, but his instincts told him that their world was about to change in ways that could not be undone. When Yasuge finally succumbed to the poison, his death sent shockwaves through the tribal structure that had held their community together. In the nomadic society of the steppes, leadership was not simply a matter of hereditary succession, but required the active support and recognition of the warriors and families who made up the tribe. A leader's authority came from his ability to provide protection, ensure successful raids and hunts, negotiate favorable agreements with other tribes, and generally maintain the complex relationships that kept the group functioning as a cohesive unit. With Yasuge's death, all of these responsibilities suddenly fell into a void that no one was immediately prepared to fill. Temujin, despite being his father's eldest son, was still just a child of perhaps 9 or 10 years, far too young to step into the demanding role of tribal leadership. The other men in the tribe looked at this boy and saw not a future Khan, but a liability, someone who would need protection and resources rather than someone capable of providing leadership and security for the group. The discussions that followed Yasuge's funeral were conducted in hushed tones around cooking fires and in the shadowy interiors of gurs, but their outcome was never really in doubt. The practical necessities of nomadic life demanded difficult decisions, and sentiment could not be allowed to override the basic requirements of survival. The tribe needed strong leadership to navigate the dangerous political landscape of the steppes, to organize successful hunting expeditions, and to defend against the constant threat of raids from rival groups. One by one, the families that had followed Yasuge began to drift away, attaching themselves to other leaders who could offer the protection and opportunities that a child could not provide. This exodus was not accomplished with dramatic declarations or angry confrontations, but rather through the quiet logic of practical necessity. A family would simply fail to appear when the tribe moved to new pastures, or would gradually distance themselves during daily activities until they had effectively separated themselves from Temujin's diminished group. The boy watched this process with a growing understanding of how precarious their position had become. Each departure reduced not only the number of people in their band, but also their collective strength and resources. Fewer families meant fewer warriors for defense, fewer hunters to provide meat, fewer herders to tend the animals, and fewer hands to perform the countless tasks necessary for survival on the steppes. The network of relationships and obligations that had supported their family was dissolving like morning mist under the warming sun. Temujin's mother, Hulun, found herself in an almost impossible situation. As a woman in a society where leadership was traditionally male, she had limited options for maintaining the loyalty of the remaining families. Her own strength and intelligence were considerable, but the harsh realities of steppe politics meant that practical considerations would ultimately override personal respect or sympathy. She watched the gradual abandonment of their family with a mixture of grief, anger, and desperate determination to somehow keep her children alive through the ordeal that was clearly approaching. The final blow came when even Yasuge's most trusted followers, men who had fought beside him and sworn oaths of loyalty, made the painful decision to seek their fortunes elsewhere. These departures were perhaps the most devastating of all, because they represented the complete collapse of the bonds that had held their tribal unit together. When these last supporters melted away into the vast expanse of the steppes, Temujin's family was left truly alone, without the protection of a larger group, and without the resources that came from being part of a functioning tribal community. What remained was a small, vulnerable family group, consisting of Hulun, her children, and perhaps one or two elderly relatives who had nowhere else to go. Their livestock had been greatly reduced, either through departures or through the practical necessities of providing for those who were leaving. Their material possessions had similarly dwindled, and most importantly, they no longer had the manpower necessary to defend themselves against the numerous dangers that threatened isolated families on the steppes. The beginning of true hardship was not long in coming. Without sufficient numbers to organize proper hunting expeditions, the family's access to fresh meat became severely limited. The few animals they retained provided some sustenance, but not enough to adequately feed everyone, especially during the harsh winter months when game became scarce and the cold increased their caloric needs. Fishing in the streams and rivers that crossed their path provided some relief, but this too required knowledge, skill, and equipment that they possessed only in limited quantities. Gathering wild plants, roots, and berries became an increasingly important part of their survival strategy, but this activity was highly dependent on seasonal availability and required extensive knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided. Hulun drew upon everything she had learned during her own childhood and the early years of her marriage, but even her considerable knowledge was sometimes insufficient to provide adequate nutrition for her growing children. The psychological impact of their situation was perhaps even more challenging than the physical hardships. Temujin, who had grown up expecting to inherit his father's position and the respect that came with it, now found himself in the role of a refugee, dependent on charity and struggling simply to survive from one day to the next. The confidence and sense of destiny that had been natural parts of his childhood were replaced by the harsh realities of constant hunger and the ever-present awareness that their situation could deteriorate even further. Sleep became fitful and anxious, filled with dreams of better times and worries about what the next day might bring. The comfortable rhythms of tribal life, with its predictable cycles of movement, hunting, and gathering, had been replaced by the desperate improvisation of people living on the margins of survival. Each morning brought new challenges and difficult decisions about how to allocate their limited resources and where to seek the food and shelter necessary to keep the family alive. The other children in the family were too young to fully understand the complexity of their situation, but they could sense the tension and fear that had replaced the security they had previously taken for granted. Meals became smaller and less frequent, and the adults spoke in worried whispers about matters that the children were not expected to understand. The playful activities that had filled their days were gradually replaced by the serious business of survival, as even the youngest family members were expected to contribute whatever they could to the group's desperate efforts to stay alive. Young Temujin began to take on responsibilities that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Despite his youth, he was now the closest thing to a male leader that the family possessed, and this role came with expectations and pressures that were almost overwhelming. He learned to hunt small game with makeshift weapons, to identify edible plants and roots, and to make the kind of difficult decisions that had previously been his father's responsibility. The childhood that should have continued for several more years was effectively ended, replaced by the premature adulthood that extreme circumstances sometimes force upon the young. The isolation of their situation was perhaps one of the most difficult aspects to endure. In the tribal society of the steppes, families were accustomed to being part of larger communities where problems were shared and resources were pooled for the common good. Now cut off from these support networks, every challenge had to be faced alone, with only their own limited resources and knowledge to draw upon. The vast landscape that had once seemed welcoming and familiar now felt empty and threatening, populated by potential enemies rather than allies. As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of even greater hardships, Temujin's family faced the possibility that they might not all survive until spring. The cold months on the steppes were always dangerous, even for well-supplied tribal groups with adequate shelter and food stores. For a small, impoverished family like theirs, winter represented a test of endurance that would push them to the very limits of their ability to survive. Yet even in these darkest moments, when starvation seemed like a very real possibility, and their future appeared uncertain at best. Something within young Temujin refused to accept defeat. Perhaps it was the memory of his father's strength and dignity, or perhaps it was simply the natural resilience that some people possess in the face of overwhelming adversity. Whatever the source, a determination was growing within him that would eventually become one of his defining characteristics, a refusal to be broken by circumstances, no matter how dire they might appear. The poison cup that had ended his father's life had also poisoned his own childhood, transforming him from a protected tribal prince into a desperate survivor fighting for his family's existence. But in this transformation, in this brutal education, in the realities of power and survival, the foundations were being laid for something that none of his enemies could have anticipated. The boy who had lost everything was learning lessons about leadership, determination, and the true nature of strength that would eventually reshape not just his own destiny, but the destiny of the entire world. Ash Chapter 3: Hunger and Exile. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steppes as Hulun rose before dawn, her movements careful and deliberate in the silence that surrounded their makeshift camp. The air was crisp, with the promise of another day that would bring its own challenges, and she could hear the soft breathing of her children, still wrapped in their thin blankets, clinging to the last moments of sleep before hunger would inevitably wake them. Her feet were bare against the cold earth as she stepped quietly away from their shelter, a simple arrangement of felt and salvaged materials that provided minimal protection against the elements, but was all they could manage in their current circumstances. The landscape around them stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in the coarse grass that sustained the herds of more fortunate families. In the distance, she could see the occasional movement of wild animals, creatures that had learned to be wary of human presence, but still offered the possibility of sustenance for those skilled and desperate enough to pursue them. The sky above was vast and clear, painted in the soft colors of early morning, and for a moment Hulun allowed herself to remember when such mornings had been filled with the comfortable sounds of a thriving tribal camp, rather than the oppressive silence of exile. Her knowledge of edible plants had been gained gradually over the years, learned from her own mother and grandmother, and supplemented by conversations with other women during the better times when such knowledge seemed like useful background information rather than the difference between life and death. Now, as she walked slowly through the grass, her eyes searched for the subtle signs that indicated the presence of roots and tubers that could provide nourishment for her family. The wild onions that grew in certain areas were a particular prize, their sharp flavor providing not only calories but also some relief from the monotony of their limited diet. The process of foraging required patience and careful observation. Many of the plants that grew on the steppes were perfectly safe for the animals that grazed there, but could be harmful or even dangerous for human consumption. Others were edible only at certain times of the year, or required specific preparation to remove toxins or make them digestible. Hulun moved methodically through the landscape, her fingers gently probing the soil around promising plants, testing the firmness of roots and the condition of leaves that might indicate whether a particular specimen was worth harvesting. The wild garlic that grew in scattered patches was another valuable find, its pungent bulbs providing both nutrition and flavor that could make even the most meager meal seem more substantial. She dug carefully with a sharp stick, working to extract the bulbs without damaging them, knowing that each one represented a small victory in their ongoing struggle against starvation. The work was slow and methodical, requiring her to move from spot to spot across considerable distances, but it was essential to gather enough material to make a meaningful contribution to their food supply. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Hualun's search expanded to include the various grasses and seeds that could be processed into something resembling grain. The wild millet that grew in certain areas could be laboriously gathered and ground into a coarse flour, though the process required considerable time and effort for relatively small quantities of finished product. She collected what she could find, storing the seeds in a small pouch made from salvaged leather, knowing that even a handful of such material could be stretched into a thin gruel that would help fill their stomachs. The bark of certain trees, particularly the birch and willow that grew near streams, could be prepared in ways that made it edible, though the process was complex and the resulting food was hardly appetizing. She had learned these techniques from older women who remembered times of great hardship when tribal groups had been forced to survive on whatever the land could provide. The inner bark had to be carefully stripped, dried, and ground into powder that could be mixed with water to create a paste that provided some nutritional value, though it was bitter and difficult to swallow. Meanwhile, back at their camp, young Temujin was learning his own harsh lessons about survival in their reduced circumstances. The comfortable routines of his earlier childhood, when meals had appeared with predictable regularity and hunger had been only a temporary inconvenience between one feast and the next, now seemed like memories from another lifetime. He had discovered that small rodents, ground squirrels, and prairie dogs could be caught with patience and improvised traps, though the process required skills he was still developing through painful trial and error. The construction of effective traps was an art that required understanding of animal behavior, knowledge of materials, and considerable patience. Temujin spent hours observing the movements of potential prey, learning their patterns and preferences, identifying the locations where they were most likely to be caught off guard. He fashioned snares from salvaged rope and carefully placed them along the paths that small animals habitually used, checking them regularly and adjusting their placement based on his growing understanding of how these creatures moved through their environment. When his traps were successful, the process of preparing the small animals for consumption was another education in the realities of survival. Every part of the creature had to be utilized, from the meat that provided protein to the bones that could be cracked open to access the marrow within. The fur and hide, though small, could be saved and eventually incorporated into clothing or shelter materials. Nothing could be wasted when resources were so scarce, and Temujin learned to approach each small success with the kind of thorough efficiency that would become characteristic of his later achievements. The younger children in the family were not exempt from the harsh realities of their situation. They learned to supplement their diet with insects and grubs that could be found under logs and stones, creatures that were hardly appetizing but provided essential proteins and fats that their growing bodies desperately needed. The process of overcoming their natural revulsion at such food was part of their education in survival, teaching them that survival sometimes required setting aside preferences and prejudices in favor of practical necessity. When food was available, its distribution within the family became a source of tension that would have been unthinkable in their previous circumstances. The simple reality was that there was rarely enough to satisfy everyone's hunger, and difficult decisions had to be made about how to allocate their meager resources. The youngest children required less food than the adults, but they also had less ability to endure prolonged hunger. The older children could theoretically survive on smaller portions, but they also needed energy for the physical activities necessary to gather more food and maintain their basic survival. These decisions were made in hushed conversations between Holun and Temujin, discussions that marked his continued transition from childhood to premature adulthood. He was learning to think not just about his own immediate needs, but about the complex calculations necessary to keep the entire family alive through each day and into an uncertain future. The luxury of eating until satisfied had been replaced by the grim mathematics of survival, where each morsel had to be weighed against the needs of others and the likelihood of finding more food in the near future. The nights were perhaps the most difficult times, when the activities of the day had ended and there was nothing to distract from the gnawing sensation of persistent hunger. The family would huddle together under their inadequate blankets, sharing body heat and trying to find positions that would allow them to sleep despite their discomfort. The felt that had once provided comfortable insulation in their traditional ger was now stretched thin and worn, full of holes that let in the cold air and provided little protection against the elements. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the wind across the steppes and the occasional cry of night-hunting animals. The children would shift restlessly, their small bodies unable to find comfort on the hard ground, their stomachs cramping with hunger that had become a constant companion. Sometimes they would dream of the abundant meals they had enjoyed in better times, only to wake to the harsh reality of their current circumstances, the contrast between dream and reality serving as a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen. Temujin's own dreams during this period were filled with complex mixtures of memory and longing. Sometimes he dreamed of his father, seeing Yeski as he had been in life, strong and confident, surrounded by loyal followers and respected by friend and enemy alike. In these dreams, their family was restored to its former position. Their ger was spacious and warm, and the sounds of a thriving tribal camp filled the air with the comfortable noise of normal life. He would wake from such dreams with a sharp sense of loss, the contrast between the dream world and their actual situation serving as a painful reminder of everything they had lost. Other dreams were focused on the future, vague but persistent visions of a time when their circumstances would be different, when hunger would no longer be a constant companion, and when safety would be something they could take for granted rather than something they had to fight for each day. These dreams were less specific than his memories, but they carried with them a sense of possibility that helped sustain him through the darkest moments of their exile. Even in sleep, some part of his mind refused to accept that their current circumstances were permanent, maintaining a stubborn belief that things could and would eventually change. The winter months brought additional challenges that tested their survival skills to the limit. The streams and rivers that had provided water and occasional fish during the warmer months now froze solid, requiring them to melt snow and ice for their basic hydration needs. The process of creating fire became more difficult as dry fuel became scarce, and the wind made it challenging to maintain flames long enough to accomplish necessary tasks. Even the simplest activities required considerably more time and effort, and the margin for error became even smaller than it had been during the more temperate seasons. Food became even scarcer during the cold months, as the small animals they had learned to trap either hibernated or moved to areas where they were less accessible. The plants and roots that had supplemented their diet during the summer were now buried under snow or had died back to underground storage organs that were difficult to locate and extract. The family's diet during these months consisted largely of whatever preserved food they had managed to set aside, supplemented by the occasional success in hunting or trapping, and by the creative use of materials that would not normally be considered edible. The bones from previous meals became valuable resources during these lean times, as they could be cracked open to access the marrow within, or boiled for extended periods to extract whatever nutrients remained in them. Old leather items could be softened and made partially edible through prolonged cooking, though the process was time-consuming and the results were hardly satisfying. Even the scraps and refuse from better times were re-examined and reconsidered, as the family learned to extract every possible bit of nourishment from materials they had previously discarded without thought. The psychological toll of prolonged hunger was perhaps even more challenging than the physical effects. The constant preoccupation with food, the need to think about every meal in terms of survival rather than satisfaction, gradually wore down their spirits and tested their ability to maintain hope for the future. The simple pleasures that had once provided relief from the hardships of nomadic life were no longer available, and even basic human interactions became strained by the stress of their circumstances. Arguments over food, which would have been unthinkable in their previous life, became occasional sources of tension within the family. The younger children, in particular, had difficulty understanding why they could not have more to eat, and their complaints and tears added to the emotional burden carried by the adults who were already struggling to maintain their own composure in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. These conflicts were always resolved quickly, as everyone understood that family unity was essential for survival, but they served as painful reminders of how their exile had changed even the most basic aspects of their relationships with each other. Yet even in these darkest moments, there were small signs of the resilience and determination that would eventually characterize Temujin's rise to power. He learned to endure discomfort without complaint, to make difficult decisions without hesitation, and to maintain focus on long-term survival, even when immediate circumstances seemed almost hopeless. The skills he was developing through necessity, the ability to find resources where none seemed to exist, and to motivate others to continue struggling when giving up would have been easier, were preparing him for challenges that he could not yet imagine. His relationship with his mother during this period was particularly important in shaping his understanding of leadership and responsibility. He watched her face each day's challenges with quiet determination, never allowing her own fears and doubts to undermine her children's confidence in their ability to survive. Her example taught him that true strength was not the absence of fear or doubt, but the ability to continue functioning effectively despite those emotions. The lessons he learned from observing her behavior during their exile would influence his approach to leadership throughout his later life. The other children in the family were also learning important lessons during this period, though they were perhaps less aware of the broader implications of their experiences. They were developing physical and mental toughness that would serve them well in the harsh world of the steppes, learning to endure discomfort and to find solutions to problems that would have seemed impossible to solve under normal circumstances. The bonds between them were strengthened by their shared hardships, creating loyalties that would persist even when their circumstances eventually improved. As winter gradually gave way to spring, bringing with it the promise of more abundant food and better weather, the family had survived what might have been their greatest test. They had learned to live on the margins of existence, to find sustenance where none seemed available, and to maintain their unity and determination despite circumstances that would have broken many others. The experience had changed them all, stripping away the comfortable assumptions of their previous life and replacing them with a hard-earned understanding of what it truly meant to survive in a world where safety and security could never be taken for granted. The knowledge and skills they had gained during their exile, from Ahalun's expertise in finding edible plants to Temujin's growing ability to hunt and trap small game, would remain with them throughout their lives. More importantly, the psychological strength they had developed, the ability to endure hardship without losing sight of their goals, had prepared them for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. In the crucible of hunger and exile, the foundation had been laid for achievements that would eventually reshape the world. Chapter 5. Capture in Chains. The morning air was still cool across the steppes when the riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky of early dawn. Young Temujin had been checking his fish traps along the riverbank, moving quietly through the tall grass that grew thick near the water's edge, when he first noticed the distant movement that would soon change everything. The peaceful rhythm of his morning routine was about to be shattered by forces that had been gathering beyond his family's awareness, enemies who had been waiting patiently for the right moment to strike at the remnants of Yeske's once proud clan. The Taichiud were among the most powerful of the rival clans that dominated the political landscape of the Mongol steppes, their influence extending across vast territories and their reputation for ruthlessness well established among the scattered tribes. They had long memories when it came to grievances and perceived slights, and they had not forgotten the conflicts that had occurred during Yeske's lifetime. Now, with the great leader dead and his family reduced to a small band of survivors, struggling merely to stay alive, they saw an opportunity to settle old scores and eliminate what they viewed as a potential future threat. The riders approached with the confident pace of those who knew they held overwhelming advantage, their horses moving in the disciplined formation that spoke of experienced warriors accustomed to working together. There was no urgency in their movement, no sense that they expected serious resistance from their intended target. They had planned this carefully, choosing their moment when Temujin was isolated from whatever meager protection his family might have been able to provide, and they moved with the casual efficiency of hunters who had cornered prey that had nowhere left to run. Temujin's first instinct was to flee, to use his knowledge of the local terrain to find some hiding place where he might wait out this danger and eventually return to his family. But the open nature of the steppes provided few opportunities for concealment, and the riders were mounted on horses that could easily outpace a young man on foot. The riverbank where he had been working offered no shelter, and the nearest cover was too far away to reach before the approaching warriors would be upon him. He found himself trapped in the open, with nowhere to go and no way to escape the fate that was rapidly approaching. The capture itself was swift and methodical, accomplished with the kind of professional competence that spoke of considerable experience in such matters. The warriors surrounded him with practiced ease, their horses moving to cut off any possible avenue of escape, while they maintained the relaxed alertness of men who were completely confident in their ability to handle the situation. There was no violence in the initial moments of his capture, no angry words or dramatic confrontations, just the quiet efficiency of skilled riders who had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. The leader of the group, A weathered man whose face bore the scars of many battles looked down at the young captive with an expression that mixed satisfaction with a kind of professional assessment. This was Temujin, son of Yesuge, the boy who represented the last vestige of a bloodline that had once commanded considerable respect and fear among the tribes. Now he stood before them as a prisoner, his future entirely in their hands, and the irony of his situation was not lost on his captors. The wooden collar that they placed around his neck was a device specifically designed for the humiliation and control of prisoners, known as a kangyu among the peoples of the steppes. It was constructed from heavy timber, carefully shaped and fitted to rest on the shoulders while encircling the neck in a way that made it impossible for the wearer to remove without assistance. The weight of the device was considerable, designed not just to prevent escape, but to serve as a constant reminder of the prisoner's helpless condition and degraded status. The process of fitting the kangi was accomplished with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his capture. The wooden pieces were carefully positioned around his neck and shoulders, then secured with iron pins that locked the device in place. Once properly installed, the collar made it impossible for Temujin to lie down comfortably, to feed himself properly, or to perform any of the basic functions of daily life without assistance. It was a form of restraint that was designed to break the spirit as much as to control the body. The journey back to the Taichud camp was a long and deliberately humiliating ordeal. Temujin was forced to walk behind the mounted warriors, the heavy wooden collar making each step a struggle and preventing him from maintaining the kind of dignified bearing that would have been natural to someone of his background. The other prisoners who had been captured in similar raids walked with him, a sad procession of defeated enemies who served as living testimony to the power and ruthlessness of their captors. The landscape through which they traveled was familiar to Temujin from his childhood wanderings, but now it seemed transformed by his changed circumstances. The rolling hills and wide valleys that had once represented freedom and possibility now served as the backdrop for his humiliation and captivity. The very familiarity of the terrain made his situation more painful, as he recognized landmarks and locations that were associated with happier times when he had roamed these same areas as a free member of his father's tribe. The Taichud warriors made no attempt to conceal their satisfaction with the success of their raid. They spoke among themselves in the relaxed tones of men who had accomplished a difficult task and were now looking forward to the rewards that would follow. Their conversation was filled with references to the bounty they would receive for delivering such a valuable prisoner, and with speculations about what would become of him once he was delivered to their leaders. They showed no concern for his comfort or well-being, treating him with a casual indifference that might be shown to any piece of valuable property. The camp of the Taichud, when they finally reached it, was a testament to their power and prosperity. The Gurs were larger and more numerous than those of most tribal groups, and the quality of their horses and weapons spoke of successful raids and profitable alliances. Cooking fires sent smoke rising into the evening sky, and the sounds of normal camp life created a constant background noise that emphasized the contrast between the captor's comfortable circumstances and the prisoner's degraded condition. Temujin's arrival in the camp was treated as a form of entertainment, with curious onlookers gathering to examine the son of the famous Yesgud and to comment on how far the mighty had fallen. Children pointed and stared at the wooden collar that marked him as a prisoner, while adults made jokes about his helpless condition and speculated about his eventual fate. The humiliation was deliberate and complete, designed to strip away any remaining sense of dignity or self-worth that might have sustained him through his ordeal. The sleeping arrangements provided for prisoners were minimal and deliberately uncomfortable. Temujin was assigned a spot on the ground near the edge of the camp, where he would be easily visible to guards, but far from the warmth and comfort of the cooking fires. The wooden collar made it impossible for him to lie down in any normal position, forcing him to sleep sitting up or in awkward positions that provided little rest. The nights were long and filled with discomfort, broken by the sounds of normal camp life and the occasional visits of guards who wanted to ensure that their valuable prisoner was still secure. During the daylight hours, Temujin was often paraded through the camp as a symbol of Taichud power and as a warning to any who might consider challenging their authority. The heavy wooden collar made these displays particularly degrading, as he was forced to shuffle along behind his captors while onlookers commented on his appearance and condition. Sometimes he was required to perform menial tasks, work that would normally be assigned to the lowest servants, while wearing the cumbersome device that marked his status as a prisoner. The psychological impact of this treatment was perhaps even more devastating than the physical discomfort. Temujin had been raised with the expectation that he would someday inherit his father's position and command the respect due to a tribal leader. Now he found himself reduced to the status of a curiosity, an object of entertainment for his captors, and a cautionary tale about the consequences of opposing the Taichi. The contrast between his expectations and his reality was stark and painful, a constant reminder of how completely his circumstances had changed. Yet even in these darkest moments, something within Temujin refused to be broken by his circumstances. Perhaps it was the memory of his father's strength and dignity, or perhaps it was simply the natural resilience that had enabled him to survive the hardships following Yasuge's death. Whatever the source, he maintained a core of inner strength that remained intact despite the humiliation and degradation of his captivity. His captors might control his body and dictate his daily activities, but they could not touch the part of him that remained free and defiant. He used the long hours of enforced inactivity to observe his captors and their routines, learning the patterns of camp life and identifying the weaknesses in their security arrangements. The wooden collar that was intended to mark him as helpless also served to make him appear less threatening, causing his guards to become gradually more relaxed in their vigilance. He noted which guards were most attentive and which were inclined to become careless, which times of day offered the best opportunities for unobserved movement, and which routes through the camp might provide the best chances for escape. The other prisoners in the camp provided him with additional information about Taichud practices and routines through careful conversations conducted in whispers during the brief moments when they were not being closely observed. He learned about previous escape attempts and the methods that had been used to prevent them. Some of the prisoners had been held for months or even years, and their experiences provided valuable insights into the daily rhythms of camp life and the opportunities that might present themselves to someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. As the days turned into weeks, Temujin's understanding of his captors' routines became increasingly detailed and sophisticated. He learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated changes in the guard schedule, the times when attention was focused on other activities, and the moments when the camp's vigilance was at its lowest ebb. The knowledge he gained during this period of enforced observation would prove invaluable when the opportunity for escape finally presented itself. The moon cycle that would provide the cover for his eventual escape began to occupy an increasingly important place in his thoughts and planning. The darkest nights of the month, when the moon provided minimal illumination, would offer the best opportunities for undetected movement outside the camp. But these same conditions would also make travel more difficult and dangerous, requiring him to balance the advantages of concealment against the challenges of navigating unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness. The plan that gradually formed in his mind was necessarily simple and flexible, accounting for the many variables that could affect its success or failure. He would need to find a way to remove or disable the wooden collar that marked him as a prisoner, locate some means of transportation that would allow him to put distance between himself and his captors before his escape was discovered, and navigate back to his family's location without being recaptured. Each element of the plan presented its own challenges and risks, but the alternative was to remain indefinitely in captivity, subject to the whims of his captors, and with no hope of ever regaining his freedom. The night chosen for his escape was one of the darkest of the month, when heavy clouds obscured even the faint light of the crescent moon and created the kind of deep darkness that would make pursuit difficult even for experienced trackers. The camp had settled into its normal nighttime routine, with most of the inhabitants asleep and only a few guards maintaining a watchful presence around the perimeter. The sounds of the night provided a natural cover for any small noises that might accompany his movements, and the cool air carried away the scents that might otherwise alert the camp's dogs to unusual activity. The removal of the wooden collar proved to be less difficult than he had anticipated, though it required considerable patience and careful manipulation of the locking mechanism. The device had been designed to prevent removal by the wearer, but it had not been constructed with the assumption that the prisoner would have extended periods of unobserved time to work on the problem. Using a combination of patient pressure and careful use of small tools that he had gradually accumulated, Temujin was able to work the pins loose and separate the wooden pieces enough to slip free of the restraint. The sensation of freedom from the heavy collar was almost overwhelming after weeks of constant confinement. His neck and shoulders, which had become accustomed to the weight and restriction of the device, felt strangely light and mobile. For the first time in many days, he was able to move his head freely and to assume natural positions that had been impossible while wearing the cane. The psychological impact of shedding this symbol of his captivity was as significant as the physical relief it provided. Moving through the darkened camp required all of the stealth and patience that he had learned during his years of hunting and foraging. Each step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise, and he had to remain constantly alert for the presence of guards or other camp inhabitants who might discover his escape attempt. The familiar sounds of the camp at night provided both cover and warning, as he learned to distinguish between the normal noises of sleeping people and animals and the sounds that might indicate danger. The horses that would provide his means of escape were kept in an area near the center of the camp, where they would normally be well protected from theft or interference. But Temujin's intimate knowledge of horses, gained through his childhood among the nomadic tribes, allowed him to approach them without causing alarm. He selected a mount that appeared strong and well-rested, one that would be capable of carrying him at speed across the difficult terrain that lay between the camp and safety. The moment of mounting the stolen horse and beginning his flight from captivity marked a turning point in Temujin's young life. As he guided the animal quietly out of the camp and into the darkness of the open steppes, he felt the first stirrings of what would eventually become his legendary desire for revenge against those who had wronged him. The humiliation and degradation of his captivity had planted seeds of anger and determination that would grow and flourish in the years to come, ultimately driving him to achievements that his captors could never have imagined. The ride through the darkness was both exhilarating and terrifying, a desperate flight toward freedom that carried with it the constant threat of recapture and the certainty of severe punishment if his escape attempt failed. But for the first time in weeks, Temujin was master of his own fate, free to make his own decisions and responsible for his own survival. The taste of freedom, after the helplessness of captivity, was sweeter than anything he had ever experienced, and it strengthened his resolve to never again allow himself to be placed in such a vulnerable position. Chapter 6. A friend named Borchu. The summer sun cast long shadows across the grasslands as young Temujin made his way slowly through the familiar landscape that surrounded his family's temporary camp. The weeks following his escape from the Taichiud had been filled with cautious movement and careful observation as he gradually made his way back to the scattered remnants of his father's people. The freedom he had won through his moonlight flight was precious beyond measure, but it came with the constant awareness that danger could appear at any moment from any direction across the vast openness of the steppes. His family's joy at his safe return had been tempered by the harsh realities of their continuing struggle for survival. The period of his captivity had been difficult for them as well, filled with uncertainty about his fate and anxiety about their own precarious position in a world where isolated families were vulnerable to countless threats. His mother Holun had embraced him with tears of relief, but even in that moment of reunion, the weight of their ongoing challenges pressed down upon them all like a heavy blanket that could not be cast aside. The loss of their horses during a recent raid had left the family in an even more desperate position than before. In the nomadic culture of the steppes, horses were not merely transportation, but the foundation of wealth, status, and survival itself. Without adequate mounts, a family could not move their possessions efficiently, could not hunt effectively, could not flee from danger, and could not participate in the complex social and economic relationships that bound the tribal world together. The theft of their animals had been a calculated blow designed to cripple their ability to function as an independent unit. It was during this period of particular hardship that fate brought Temujin into contact with a boy whose friendship would prove to be one of the most significant relationships of his young life. Borchu was perhaps a year or two older than Temujin, the son of a family that belonged to a different clan, but shared the same general territory and faced many of the same challenges that confronted all of the smaller groups trying to maintain their independence in an increasingly dangerous world. The first meeting between the two boys occurred during one of Temujin's solitary journeys in search of their stolen horses. He had been following tracks that led across several days' worth of travel, moving carefully to avoid detection while trying to determine the location of the animals that represented his family's best hope for restored mobility and security. The trail had led him into territory that was unfamiliar but not entirely foreign, grasslands that looked much like those surrounding his own family's camp, but that carried the subtle signs of belonging to a different group's traditional range. Borchu was engaged in his own activities when their paths first crossed, tending to his family's animals in the methodical way that nomadic children learned from their earliest years. There was something in his manner that immediately struck Temujin as different from most of the other young people he had encountered during his travels. Where others might have shown suspicion or hostility toward a stranger, Boorchu displayed a kind of natural openness that suggested both confidence and genuine curiosity about the world around him. The conversation that developed between them was cautious at first, as both boys tested the waters of potential friendship while remaining alert to the possibility that the other might represent some form of threat. But gradually, as they shared information about their respective circumstances and discovered the many similarities in their experiences, a sense of mutual understanding began to develop. Both were members of families that had fallen on hard times. Both had learned to be resourceful in the face of scarcity, and both carried the kind of quiet determination that marked those who had been forced to grow up quickly in a harsh and unforgiving world. When Temujin explained the purpose of his journey and described the stolen horses he was trying to track, Boorchu listened with the kind of focused attention that indicated genuine interest rather than mere politeness. The older boy had noticed the same tracks that Temujin was following, and he was able to provide additional information about the likely destination of the thieves and the best routes for approaching their camp without being detected. More importantly, he offered to join in the effort to recover the stolen animals, a gesture that represented both considerable personal risk and a level of trust that was unusual between strangers. The decision to work together in pursuit of the stolen horses marked the beginning of a partnership that would prove to be far more significant than either boy could have anticipated at the time. Boorchu's knowledge of the local terrain and his understanding of the various groups that moved through the area complemented Temujin's tracking skills and his intimate knowledge of his family's animals. Together, they were able to develop a plan for approaching the thieves' camp that had a reasonable chance of success while minimizing the risks involved in such a dangerous undertaking. The journey to locate the stolen horses took them across several days of travel through increasingly unfamiliar territory. During this time, the two boys had ample opportunity to learn about each other's backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives on the world around them. They would approach the camp during the pre-dawn hours, when vigilance was typically at its lowest, identify the location of the stolen horses, and create a diversion that would allow them to drive the animals away before their theft was discovered. The execution of this plan required careful timing, considerable stealth, and a willingness to improvise when circumstances did not unfold exactly as anticipated. The actual recovery of the horses went more smoothly than either boy had dared to hope. The thieves had become complacent after several days without any sign of pursuit, and their security arrangements were less thorough than they might have been under different circumstances. Boorchu's ability to move silently through the darkness and his skill in handling horses proved invaluable, while Temujin's intimate knowledge of his family's animals allowed him to identify them quickly and guide them away from the camp without causing alarm. The successful completion of their mission created a bond between the two boys that went far deeper than simple friendship. They had trusted each other with their lives, had worked together under dangerous circumstances, and had achieved something that neither could have accomplished alone. The shared experience of risk and success created the kind of mutual loyalty that would prove unbreakable even under the most difficult circumstances that might arise in the future. The journey back to Temujin's family camp was filled with a sense of accomplishment and growing friendship that made the long hours of travel seem to pass quickly. Boorchu proved to be an entertaining companion, sharing stories from his own experiences and demonstrating the kind of quiet humor that made even difficult circumstances more bearable. His presence transformed what could have been a tense and anxious journey into something approaching an adventure as the two boys celebrated their success and planned for the challenges that would inevitably arise in the future. When they reached Temujin's family camp, Boorchu's arrival was greeted with the kind of warm hospitality that nomadic culture reserved for those who had demonstrated friendship through actions rather than words. Holun welcomed him as if he were one of her own children, and the other family members quickly recognized the debt they owed to this young stranger who had risked his own safety to help recover their precious horses. The evening meal that followed their arrival was one of the most cheerful occasions the family had experienced in many months. During the days that followed, Boorchu remained with Temujin's family, sharing in their daily activities and contributing his own skills and knowledge to their ongoing struggle for survival. His presence brought not only additional manpower, but also a kind of emotional support that had been missing since the dark days following Yuge's death. The younger children in particular seemed to benefit from having an older boy around who could serve as both protector and friend, someone who understood their circumstances without pitying them for their reduced condition. The friendship that developed between Temujin and Boorchu during this period was characterized by the kind of easy companionship that made even mundane activities more enjoyable. They worked together in hunting and foraging, shared the responsibilities of caring for the family's animals, and spent long hours in conversation about their hopes and plans for the future. Their different backgrounds and experiences provided each with new perspectives on familiar problems, while their shared values and goals created a foundation for trust that would prove unshakable. One of the most significant aspects of their friendship was the way it began to shape Temujin's understanding of leadership and loyalty. Boorchu had chosen to align himself with Temujin's family, not because of any existing obligation or expectation of reward, but simply because he recognized in the younger boy qualities that commanded his respect and allegiance. This freely given loyalty was different from the kind of tribal obligations that had bound his father's followers, and it suggested possibilities for building relationships based on personal merit rather than inherited status. The conversations between the two boys often turned to discussions of the future and the kinds of lives they hoped to build for themselves. Boorchu's presence provided Temujin with someone his own age who could understand his ambitions without dismissing them as childish fantasies. Together, they began to develop ideas about what it might mean to create a different kind of tribal organization, one based on demonstrated ability and earned loyalty rather than the traditional structures that had proven so fragile in the face of changing circumstances. Wrestling matches, races across the grasslands, and contests of skill with improvised weapons served multiple purposes, keeping them in fighting condition while providing opportunities for friendly rivalry and shared laughter. These activities also served as training for the more serious challenges they might face in the future, developing reflexes and abilities that could prove crucial in life or death situations. The stories they told each other during the long evenings around their small cooking fire became an important part of their friendship, sharing memories from their respective childhoods and dreams for their future accomplishments. Boruchu's tales of his own family's history and traditions provided Temujin with insights into different approaches to the challenges of nomadic life, while Temujin's accounts of his father's achievements and the lessons he had learned during his own adventures gave Boruchu a deeper understanding of his friend's background and motivations. As autumn approached and the weather began to change, bringing with it new challenges and different opportunities, the friendship between Temujin and Boruchu had evolved into something that would prove to be one of the most important relationships in both of their lives. They had learned to trust each other completely, to work together effectively under pressure, and to share both the burdens and benefits of their difficult circumstances. The loyalty that had been freely given by Boruchu had been matched by Temujin's own commitment to their friendship, creating a bond that would endure through all of the trials and triumphs that lay ahead. The foundation that was being laid during this period of their youth would eventually support achievements that neither boy could have imagined as they sat together in the grass of the steppes, sharing whatever food they had managed to find and planning for an uncertain future. The lessons they were learning about loyalty, leadership, and the power of freely chosen alliances would shape their understanding of human relationships and provide the groundwork for building the kind of organization that could unite the scattered tribes of the Mongol world under a single banner. In the quiet moments when they sat together watching the sun set over the endless grasslands, both boys perhaps sensed that their friendship represented something larger than their individual circumstances. They were discovering principles of trust and mutual support that could serve as models for the kinds of relationships that might someday bind together groups much larger than their small family unit. The brotherhood they were forging in the crucible of shared hardship was creating patterns that would eventually be replicated on a scale that encompassed entire nations and changed the course of world history. Havhos Chapter 7, Berti, in the vast expanse of the Mongolian steppes, where the wind carries whispers of ancient stories across endless grasslands, there comes a moment in every young person's life when childhood dreams begin to transform into the deeper currents of adulthood. For Temujin, the boy who would one day be known as Genghis Khan, this transformation was embodied in a single name that would echo through his heart for the rest of his days. Berti. Her name itself seems to carry the gentle rhythm of hoofbeats across soft earth, a sound that would become the soundtrack to one of history's most enduring love stories. The arrangement had been made when they were both children, as was the custom among the nomadic tribes of the steppes. Yasuge, Temujin's father, had traveled to the lands of the Angarat tribe, seeking to strengthen the bonds between their peoples through marriage. It was a practice as old as the grasslands themselves, these careful weavings of alliance and kinship that held the scattered tribes together like threads in a great tapestry. The Angarat were known for the beauty of their women, and Dei Sechin, their leader, had welcomed Yasuge with the warmth that one warrior extends to another when mutual benefit is at hand. In the quiet of Dei Sechin's chair, surrounded by the soft glow of oil lamps and the gentle rustle of felt walls in the evening breeze, the two fathers had spoken of their children's futures. Berta was perhaps 9 years old then, a girl with eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the eternal sky above the steppes. She possessed that particular quality that the Mongols treasured above all else in their women, a combination of strength and grace that could weather the harsh realities of nomadic life while maintaining the gentle dignity that made a jair into a home. Temujin, at roughly the same age, had stood beside his father with the serious demeanor of a boy trying to understand the weight of adult decisions. Even then, there was something in his bearing that suggested the future that lay ahead of him, though none could have imagined the true scope of what was to come. When he looked at Bertie, he saw not just a pretty girl from a neighboring tribe, but something that stirred a feeling he could not yet name. It was as if the wind itself had whispered to him of destinies intertwined, of two lives that would become so thoroughly woven together that neither could exist completely without the other. The betrothal was sealed with the exchange of gifts and the sharing of fermented mare's milk, the sacred air egg that bound promises on the steppes. Yesuke left his son with Dei Sechin, as was customary, so that Temujin might learn the ways of his future wife's people and begin the slow process of becoming part of their extended family. For a boy who had known little stability in his young life, this period with the Angarate represented something precious and rare. It was a time of peace, of learning, and of the gradual blossoming of something beautiful between two children who were slowly growing into something more. During those months with the Angarate, Temujin discovered aspects of himself that the harsh realities of his own tribal life had never allowed to surface. Here, in the relative security of Dei Sechin's protection, he could simply be a boy learning to become a man, without the constant pressure of survival that had shaped his earlier years. He learned the Angarate songs, their particular methods of horse training, their ways of reading the weather and the behavior of the herds. But more than anything, he learned Birdie. She was unlike any girl he had known, where the women of his own clan had been hardened by loss and struggle. Birdie possessed a kind of luminous strength that seemed to draw light from the very air around her. She moved through her daily tasks with a fluid grace that made even the most mundane activities seem like a form of dance. When she worked with her hands, whether preparing food or crafting leather goods, there was a meditative quality to her movements that brought a sense of calm to anyone who watched her. But it was not her beauty alone that captured Temujin's growing attention. Berta possessed a mind that was both sharp and curious, qualities that were highly valued among the Mongols, but not always encouraged in their women. She asked questions about the world beyond their immediate grasp, about the movements of the distant tribes, about the meanings behind the old stories that the elders told around the fires at night. When Temujin spoke of his own dreams and ambitions, she listened with an intensity that made him feel as though his words carried more weight than he had ever imagined possible. Their childhood partnership deepened gradually, like the slow change of seasons on the steppes. What had begun as the formal politeness expected between betrothed children evolved into something richer and more complex. They began to seek each other's company, not because it was expected of them, but because they genuinely enjoyed the comfort and stimulation they found in each other's presence. Long conversations replaced awkward silences, and shared laughter replaced the careful formality that had initially characterized their interactions. Temujin found himself thinking of her during the quiet moments of the day, when he was out with the herds or practicing his skills with bow and sword. The memory of her voice would come to him unexpectedly, bringing with it a warmth that seemed to settle in his chest and remain there like a gentle flame. When he achieved some small success in his training, or impressed the Angarat men with his developing abilities, his first thought was always of sharing the news with Bertie, of seeing the light of pride that would brighten her eyes when she heard of his accomplishments. For her part, Berthe began to see in Temujin something that perhaps even he did not yet fully recognize in himself. Beneath the careful politeness that he showed to her family, beneath the sometimes awkward enthusiasm of a boy trying to prove himself worthy of respect, she glimpsed the outlines of the man he was becoming. There was a quality of determination in him that went beyond mere stubbornness, a vision of possibility that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of daily survival that occupied most of their contemporaries. She noticed how he watched the movements of the herds, not just with the practical eye of a herder concerned with the immediate welfare of the animals, but with the broader perspective of someone trying to understand the larger patterns that governed life on the steppes. When the adults discussed tribal politics or the shifting alliances between different groups, Temujin listened with an intensity that suggested he was not merely trying to understand the present situation, but was thinking several moves ahead, considering implications and possibilities that others had not yet recognized. The transformation of their relationship from childhood arrangement to something deeper happened so gradually that neither of them could have pointed to a specific moment when everything changed. It was like watching the grass grow on the steppes, an imperceptible daily process that nonetheless results in fundamental transformation over time. One day they were children playing at being adults, and the next they were young people genuinely preparing for a life together, each discovery about the other adding another layer to the foundation of what was becoming a profound partnership. Their conversations began to include discussions of the future they would build together, tentative at first, but growing bolder as they became more comfortable with the idea that their lives were truly becoming intertwined. Bertie spoke of the kind of home she wanted to create, not just the physical jair that would shelter them, but the deeper sense of place and belonging that would make their family unit strong enough to weather whatever challenges the steppes might throw at them. Temujin, in turn, began to share with her the dreams that he had hardly dared voice even to himself. Visions of a life that would extend beyond the immediate concerns of herding and survival to encompass something larger and more significant. The wedding, when it finally took place, was both a celebration and a confirmation of what had already begun to develop between them. By Mongol standards, it was a substantial affair, reflecting both the importance that Dei Sechin placed on his daughter's marriage and the growing respect that the Angarat had developed for their future son-in-law. The festivities lasted for several days, with elaborate feasts, competitions of skill, and the kind of storytelling and music that could continue from sunset to sunrise without anyone feeling that time was being wasted. But for Temujin and Berthe themselves, the most meaningful moments of their wedding were the quiet ones, the brief interludes between public celebrations when they could simply look at each other and recognize that something fundamental had shifted in their lives. They were no longer two separate individuals whose paths had been joined by the practical considerations of their elders. They had become something new together, a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts, a unity that would prove capable of weathering storms that would have destroyed lesser bonds. The early days of their marriage were marked by a happiness that seemed to infuse everything around them with additional warmth and meaning. Temujin had never known the particular joy that comes from having someone who is completely and utterly on your side, someone whose welfare has become so thoroughly intertwined with your own that their happiness and your happiness are essentially the same thing. Berthe brought to their life together not just the practical skills that were essential for survival on the steppes, but also a quality of emotional stability that allowed Temujin to begin thinking beyond mere survival toward the larger possibilities that his dreams suggested. Their jair became a place of refuge and planning, a space where they could discuss not just the immediate requirements of daily life, but the broader questions of how they wanted to live and what they hoped to accomplish together. Berta proved to be not just a supportive wife, but an active partner in thinking through the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead of them. Her insights were often different from his own, offering perspectives that he would not have reached on his own, and their discussions became a crucial part of the process by which Temujin began to develop the strategic thinking that would later serve him so well. But happiness on the steppes was always a fragile thing, subject to the sudden disruptions that were an inevitable part of nomadic life. The various tribes existed in a constant state of shifting alliances and potential conflict, and even the most peaceful periods could be shattered by raids, disputes over grazing rights, or the simple reality that survival sometimes required taking from others what could not be obtained through trade or cooperation. The raid that would change everything came without warning, as such disasters always did. Temujin had been away from their camp, possibly hunting or attending to some matter involving their herds when the Merkits struck. The Merkits were a powerful tribe with their own grievances and ambitions, and they had decided that the time was right to settle some old scores while simultaneously strengthening their own position through the acquisition of horses, livestock, and captives. The attack was swift and devastating, planned with the kind of tactical precision that marked the difference between a mere raid and a serious military operation. By the time Temujin became aware of what was happening, the Merkits were already withdrawing, taking with them not just material goods, but something infinitely more precious. Berde was among their captives, swept away in the chaos of the raid, along with other women and children who would serve as both laborers and symbols of the Merkits' victory over their enemies. The moment when Temujin realized that Berde was gone represents one of those pivotal points in a life where everything that comes after is fundamentally different from everything that came before. The young man who had been learning to build a peaceful life with his beloved wife was instantly transformed into something else entirely, something driven by a desperation and determination that would accept no compromise and brook no delay. The comfortable rhythms of daily life were abandoned, replaced by the single, overwhelming imperative of bringing Berde home. The pain of her absence was unlike anything Temujin had ever experienced. It was not merely the sadness of missing someone dear to him, though that was certainly part of it. It was the more fundamental anguish that comes from having part of yourself torn away, from being forced to continue existing in a world that no longer made complete sense, because the person who had become the center of that world was no longer there to share it with you. But alongside the pain came something else, something that would prove to be equally important in shaping what happened next. The rage that filled Temujin was not the hot, destructive anger that burns itself out quickly and leaves nothing but ash behind. It was the cold, focused fury of someone who has been pushed beyond the point where compromise or negotiation remains possible, someone for whom the only acceptable outcome is the complete restoration of what has been taken, regardless of the cost. The quest to recover Berti became the driving force of Temujin's existence. Every decision, every alliance, every strategic choice was evaluated primarily in terms of how it might contribute to bringing her back safely. He reached out to relatives, to old friends, to anyone who might be willing to provide assistance in what would necessarily be a major military undertaking. The Merkits were not a weak or isolated tribe that could be easily intimidated into returning their captives. They were a formidable opponent that would require careful planning and substantial force to defeat. The process of assembling the coalition that would eventually rescue Berti became Temujin's first real experience in the kind of large-scale political and military organization that would later characterize his rise to power. He had to learn how to appeal to different tribes and leaders, how to balance competing interests and demands, how to inspire confidence in his ability to lead a successful campaign against a dangerous enemy. The skills he developed during this period would prove invaluable in his later conquests, but at the time his only concern was their immediate application to the problem of bringing his wife home. The campaign against the Merkits was not a simple matter of assembling warriors and charging into battle. It required patience, intelligence gathering, and careful coordination between different groups that did not necessarily have a history of working together smoothly. Temujin had to learn how to manage personalities and egos, how to distribute responsibilities and rewards in ways that would maintain the cohesion of his coalition, how to make the kinds of difficult decisions that would be necessary if the rescue attempt was to have any chance of success. Throughout this entire period, the thought of Berti sustained him through moments when the magnitude of the task seemed overwhelming. He knew that she was out there somewhere, probably being held as a captive wife by one of the Merkit leaders, forced to endure a situation that would be almost unbearable for someone who had known the freedom and respect that characterized her life before the raid. The knowledge of her suffering added urgency to his efforts, but it also gave him strength because he knew that she would be waiting for him, maintaining her own hope and determination until the moment when he could reach her. The actual rescue, when it finally came, was both triumphant and heartbreaking. The coalition that Temujin had assembled was successful in its attack on the Merkit camp, overwhelming their enemies and recovering the captives who had been taken in the original raid. But the Berti who was returned to him was not entirely the same person who had been taken away. The experience of captivity had left its marks on her, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Yet in another sense, she was exactly the same person he had fallen in love with. Her fundamental strength, her essential dignity, her capacity for love and partnership had all survived intact, despite everything she had been forced to endure. When they were finally reunited, when they could hold each other again and begin the slow process of rebuilding their life together, it became clear that what they had together was strong enough to survive even the worst that the world could throw at them. The experience of losing and recovering Berti marked the end of Temujin's youth in the most fundamental sense. The young man who had been content to build a quiet life with his wife was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that in a world where such happiness could be destroyed so suddenly and completely, the only real security lay in becoming powerful enough to protect what you loved. The desperate quest to win her back had taught him lessons about leadership, about the exercise of power, about the necessity of being strong enough to defend what mattered most to you. That would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. But it had also deepened and strengthened the bond between them in ways that might not have been possible under more peaceful circumstances. They had learned that their love was strong enough to survive the worst test that fate could devise, and that knowledge gave their partnership a foundation of absolute trust and commitment that would endure through all the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. In losing and finding each other again, they had discovered that they were not just husband and wife, but true partners in every sense of the word, bound together by something that was stronger than the forces that had tried to tear them apart. The story of Berthe represents far more than just a romantic interlude in the life of the future Genghis Khan. It was the crucible in which many of his most important qualities were forged, the experience that taught him both the precious fragility of happiness and the absolute necessity of being strong enough to defend it. In learning to fight for her, he learned to fight for everything else that would matter to him throughout his remarkable life, and in winning her back, he gained not just a wife but a partner whose strength and wisdom would prove invaluable in all the great undertakings that were yet to come. Chapter 8. Gathering Strength. In the aftermath of great upheaval, when the familiar patterns of life have been shattered and scattered like leaves before an autumn wind, there comes a time for gathering. Not the gentle gathering of harvest seasons, when abundance flows naturally into waiting hands, but the deliberate, careful accumulation of strength that begins with nothing more than will and determination. For Temujin, in the wake of recovering Berthe and the harsh lessons learned from their separation, this period of gathering would prove to be as crucial as any of the great battles that would later mark his rise to power. It was during these years that the foundations were laid, not just for an army, but for a new way of thinking about loyalty, leadership, and the bonds that hold men together in pursuit of something greater than themselves. The success of the rescue mission had brought Temujin a measure of recognition among the scattered tribes of the steppes, but recognition alone was not enough to ensure safety or prosperity in a world where strength was the only currency that truly mattered. The coalition that had come together to defeat the Merkits had been a temporary alliance, born of specific circumstances and dissolving naturally once its immediate purpose had been achieved. What Temujin needed now was something more permanent, more reliable, something that would not melt away when the immediate crisis had passed, but would instead grow stronger with time and shared experience. The process of building such a force began in the most humble way imaginable, with conversations around cooking fires and quiet words spoken between men who had fought together and discovered that they shared something more than mere temporary convenience. There were warriors from the recent campaign who had been impressed not just by Temujin's determination to recover his wife, but by the way he had handled the complex negotiations and planning that had made the rescue possible. They had seen in him qualities of leadership that suggested capabilities extending far beyond the immediate situation, and some of them began to consider the possibility that their own futures might be better served by continuing to follow this young man than by returning to the uncertain prospects that awaited them in their original tribes. The first to join him were men who had little to lose and much to gain from taking such a gamble. Younger sons who would inherit nothing from their fathers, warriors whose own clans had been weakened by raids or internal disputes, men who had demonstrated skill in battle but lacked the family connections or political advantages that would allow them to advance within the traditional tribal structures. These were not desperate men, exactly, but they were men who understood that the conventional paths to success and security might not be open to them, and who were therefore willing to consider alternatives that others might dismiss as too risky or unconventional. Temujin's approach to recruiting these early followers was marked by a careful attention to individual character and capability that would become one of his defining traits as a leader. He was not interested in building a large force quickly by accepting anyone who volunteered. Instead, he focused on identifying men who possessed specific qualities that he had learned were essential for the kind of organization he wanted to create. Loyalty was important, of course, but it had to be intelligent loyalty, the kind that came from genuine respect and shared purpose rather than mere personal attachment or hope of immediate reward. He looked for men who could think as well as fight, who understood that warfare on the steppes required not just physical courage, but strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The traditional model of tribal warfare, with its emphasis on individual heroics and spontaneous raids, was giving way to something more sophisticated, and Temujin needed followers who could evolve along with the changing nature of conflict. He needed men who could learn, who could accept new ideas and methods, who could subordinate their individual desires to the needs of the larger group when circumstances demanded it. The band that began to coalesce around him during this period was small at first, perhaps 24 men who had committed themselves to following his leadership wherever it might lead them. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in quality and dedication. These were men who had chosen to bind their fates to his, not out of desperation or lack of alternatives, but because they genuinely believed that he offered them the best chance of achieving the kind of life they wanted for themselves and their families. The early years of this association were marked by hardship that would have broken a less committed group. The steppes could be unforgiving to those who lacked the security and resources that came with membership in established tribes, and Temujin's growing band often found themselves operating on the margins of nomadic society, making do with whatever shelter and sustenance they could find or create for themselves. There were times when they lived in caves, carved into hillsides, huddled together around small fires that provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth, sharing whatever food they had managed to hunt or forage during the day. The caves became temporary homes during the harshest winter months, when the steppes were swept by winds that could freeze a man to death in minutes if he were caught unprepared. These underground shelters were cramped and uncomfortable, offering little privacy and requiring everyone to live in closer proximity than would normally be considered acceptable among the freedom-loving peoples of Mongolia. But they also became crucibles of solidarity, places where men learned to depend on each other completely, where individual preferences and complaints had to be set aside in favor of group survival. During these cave-bound months, Temujin began to develop many of the leadership techniques that would later serve him so well in commanding much larger forces. He learned how to manage the inevitable personality conflicts that arose when men were forced to live in such close quarters for extended periods. He developed systems for fairly distributing resources and responsibilities, ensuring that no one felt that he was being asked to bear more than his fair share of the group's burdens. Most importantly, he learned how to maintain morale and purpose during periods when immediate prospects seemed bleak and the ultimate goals of their association seemed impossibly distant. The forest provided different challenges and opportunities. Unlike the open steppes, where movement was relatively easy, but concealment was almost impossible, the wooded areas offered excellent hiding places, but made it difficult to maintain the mobility that was essential to their survival strategy. Living in the forests required different skills, different ways of thinking about space and movement and security. The men had to learn how to move quietly through dense undergrowth, how to build shelters that would be invisible to casual observation, how to hunt forest animals that behaved very differently from the creatures of the open grasslands. These forest periods were valuable for more than just their practical lessons in survival and concealment. They provided opportunities for intensive training and preparation that would have been impossible while maintaining the constant movement that characterized life on the steppes. Hidden away from the eyes of potential enemies, Temujin could work with his men on developing new tactics and techniques, experimenting with different approaches to mounted warfare, archery, and the kind of coordinated group movement that would be essential if they were ever to take on larger and more established forces. The frozen rivers of winter presented perhaps the most severe test of the group's cohesion and determination, when the waterways that normally provided barriers and boundaries became solid highways that could be traversed by anyone with sufficient courage and preparation. The small band found itself both more vulnerable to discovery and more capable of striking at targets that would be unreachable during other seasons. Living along these frozen arteries required constant vigilance, since they provided easy routes of approach for any enemies who might be seeking to locate and destroy the growing threat that Temujin represented. But the rivers also provided opportunities that the more cautious and conventional tribal leaders were reluctant to exploit. The ice created temporary bridges that could be used to reach isolated settlements or to escape from pursuing forces by routes that would be impossible during the warmer months. Learning to navigate and fight on these treacherous surfaces became another element in the comprehensive education that Temujin was providing for his followers, another skill that would distinguish them from their more traditionally trained opponents. The first raids conducted by this small force were necessarily modest affairs, carefully planned operations against targets that were vulnerable enough to be overcome by a small group of highly motivated warriors. These were not the grand campaigns that would later characterize Temujin's career, but rather the patient accumulation of resources, experience, and reputation that would make those larger operations possible. Each successful raid served multiple purposes, providing immediate material benefits while also building confidence and cohesion within the group and sending subtle messages to the broader tribal community about the growing capabilities of this new force. The planning and execution of these early raids revealed aspects of Temujin's character that had not been fully evident during his earlier experiences. He demonstrated a talent for gathering and analyzing intelligence that went far beyond the casual information sharing that was typical of steppe warfare. Before committing his men to any action, he insisted on understanding not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader context that might affect the outcome of the operation. He wanted to know about the relationships between different groups, about recent events that might have affected the morale or preparedness of potential targets,